Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Insider Secrets for Negotiating with Managed Care Companies, presented by Ron Howrigan of Fulcrum Strategies and Carl Johnson of Metagain. I'm Clint Hughes. I am your host for today. Just to let you know, a little housekeeping at the very beginning. We will have a recording of the webinar for your review, a copy of all the slides, and you will also be able to get that ebook we promised, MACRA, the 7 things you need to do now. So let me begin by introducing our presenters today. This is Ron. As you can see, he's the president and founder of Fulcrum Strategies, the superior provider for advocates, you, the physicians out there in the field. As you can see, he has impeccable credentials, 30 years in the healthcare industry, 18 years in the managed care industry. He's held senior level management positions in 3 of the largest managed care companies. He has represented over 1,500 physicians in over 29 states, increasing their reimbursements by over $100 million, which is quite an accomplishment. Ron will be conducting the majority of the webinar today. I would also like to introduce Carl Johnson. He's the Senior VP of Business Development here at Metagain. He also has a few decades in the healthcare industry. He began there with the John Muir Medical Center in California. He's held senior management positions with Tenet Healthcare and also a multi-hospital system in New Jersey. He is very experienced in physician practices operations, their financial and new outpatient business development. So those are our presenters for today. On the right, you will see a box where you can put in questions, because we will have a question and answer period at the end of the webinar today. So first, without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron for some opening remarks, and then we will cover the agenda. Ron.
Great, thank you much. As you heard, my name is Ron Howrigan. I'm the President and CEO of Fulcrum Strategies. And as you can see from my background, I spent the early part of my career, what some people refer to as a misspent youth, working for various managed care companies across the country. I worked for Blue Cross Plan, Cigna, Kaiser Permanente. In each of those plans, my job basically was to negotiate contracts against physicians and hospitals. My salary, my bonus was all set based on how much care I could get at the lowest possible price. Whenever I'm talking to a group like this, I almost feel like I need to do a different sort of an opening. Hi, my name is Ron. I'm a recovering managed care executive. I've been clean and sober of the effects of managed care for 12 years, 2 months, and 10 days now.
So you came from the dark side, and now you're back on our side, right, Ron?
I did. I came from the dark side. So, and I give that background plus the last 12 years where I've been on the other side of the negotiating table helping physicians negotiate, so that you understand where some of this information is coming from. It comes from a combination of the last 12 years where I've been working for physicians, and then the previous 18 years where I was working for the payers. Next slide, please. So what we're going to go through is we're going to do a little bit of foundation setting. We're going to talk about the reality of the world post the Affordable Care Act and how the exchange world works, how that changed the payers, because that has a huge impact on how they negotiate. We're going to talk about why negotiations are critical. I'm going to go through the process, and it is a process. Go through the position evaluation, goal setting, all of that stuff on how you get ready to negotiate. And then we're going to go through some negotiation tactics and examples. These are things carriers will use and how to combat them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, since we had an election a couple of weeks ago, you may have heard about it, what happens next post-election. Next slide, please. So I always like to start out with, especially when we're talking about the Affordable Care Act, with Newton's third law. To every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. When the Affordable Care Act got passed, a 2,000+ page piece of legislation that impacts what is arguably the largest segment of our economy, there was going to be a reaction. There's no way that you could pass that kind of legislation and not have the marketplace and all parts of the marketplace react to it. Payers specifically reacted to it, and we're seeing now the effects of the Affordable Care Act on the payers, and how they deal with that and they address that in their negotiations. So we need to understand that this is not a static environment. There's going to be reactions and we need to be ready for it. Next slide. Now, I'm an economist by training, so by law I have to use at least one graph in every presentation, so this is it. But this is actually a very poignant graph, and it's the one thing that if I had one picture to show people about healthcare to explain why things have to change, this is it. Basically, this graph shows the amount of the U.S. economy, or the percentage of gross domestic product, that gets consumed by healthcare over time. You can see that in 1960, healthcare consumed 5% of the U.S. economy. Today, we are approaching 20% of the U.S. economy. This is healthcare hyperinflation. Okay. To put this into perspective, in 1960, the Defense Department was 10% of the U.S. economy. It was twice as big as healthcare. Today, the Defense Department is 5% of the U.S. economy. So healthcare has gone from being half the size of the Defense Department to 4 times its size. Now, I'm an economist. I can tell you that these trends have to reverse themselves. They cannot continue. Every trend like this eventually changes. Just like I've got a good friend of mine who's a pilot who is fond of telling me that all planes land eventually. We all know surgeons who have made the comment that all bleeding stops eventually. Well, this trend will reverse itself. We can't continue to consume more and more of the U.S. economy through healthcare, or eventually one day we're all working in healthcare. We know that won't happen. So this is showing the enormous financial pressures. Now, how that manifests itself is the payers take those pressures and they're trying to bend the cost curve either by negotiating lower price per unit or allowing less units. Those are the only 2 variables you can play with. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about something called managed competition and then the Affordable Care Act and exchanges. Now, the reason for this is managed competition was actually a white paper written by a healthcare economist in 1993, Alan Enthoven. Enthoven is a wonderful healthcare economist from Stanford, and he wrote this paper in 1993, and it was designed to decide how we were going to fix the healthcare inflation problem in this country. And he called it managed competition. And basically in the paper he outlined, he said, you know, you've got to create uniform benefit plans. You're going to have to force universal coverage. He said you're going to have competition not only between plans, but also between delivery systems. Now, when you start thinking about this, think about this in perspective of the Affordable Care Act. Uniform benefit plans. That sounds a lot like the bronze plan, the silver plan, the gold plan. Forced universal coverage. Gosh, that sounds a lot like the employer mandate and the individual mandate. Competition not only between plans, but also delivery systems. All over the country, we're starting to see these narrow networks or subset networks where they're saying, well, you know, if you want this delivery system, you have to pick this product, but this other product competes with it. He said you create a marketplace where transparent pricing drives purchasing decisions. Well, that looks a lot like the healthcare exchanges. Now, the reason why I bring up Enthoven and managed competition is not to just show that in 93 he sort of predicted what would happen with the Affordable Care Act, but because Enthoven wrote his end game. What happens eventually, and what he said was it'll drive budget-based capitation, and that the end result will be a more efficient, effective economic marketplace. The budget-based capitation hasn't happened yet all over the country. It's happening in some parts of the country, but it's an area where the payers are starting to drive to, and you need to keep that in mind when you're negotiating with them. Next slide. Now, we talked about that Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. For the payers, some of that reaction was consolidation or attempted consolidation. So in one 3-week period of time last summer, there were 3 major deals announced. Aetna announced it was buying Humana for $37 billion. Anthem announced it was buying Cigna for $54 billion. And Centene announced it was buying HealthNet for $7 billion. So basically, $100 billion of money got announced within about 3 weeks of these acquisitions. Next slide. The reason for that is that they were consolidating to improve market share. In a lot of their public statements, they even talked about the fact that this would give them more negotiating leverage. So before consolidation, these were the top 7 payers. United Healthcare at $141 billion, Anthem at $61, Aetna at $58, and on down the line. Now the next slide will show what would happen after consolidation. So after consolidation, you've still got United at $141, but if Anthem and Cigna are allowed to merge, They merged together, Aetna and Humana merged together, and Centene and HealthNet merged together, and then we get something that looks like this. Next slide. We now get 4 health plans, if this is allowed, and I'll talk about that in just a second, where United is at 141, the Aetna Humana is at 106, Anthem Cigna at 90, and Centene HealthNet are at 30. That's $367 billion of healthcare expenses controlled by 4 companies. Medicare is only $505 billion with these payments. So you can see where we would have enough consolidation to where these 4 companies would start to produce enormous leverage against physicians. Now, the caveat to this is the federal government has stepped in and said that they don't like the Aetna-Humana merger and they don't like the Anthem-Cigna merger, and the Department of Justice has filed lawsuits to try to block both mergers. It remains to be seen whether the parties will negotiate and allow the mergers to go forward, because they could negotiate with the DOJ, or whether the court case will complete and what the verdict of that would be. But if it's allowed to go forward, we will have an enormously consolidated payer market with incredible leverage over providers. Next slide. There are other payer responses as well. Tiered networks, these networks where not everybody is included in all networks. A payer's exchange network or bronze network may only include some physicians or some hospitals. I think one of the most dramatic examples I've seen of that was a payer in the Los Angeles, California area that had 3 different networks based on what you wanted to buy, and obviously the broadest network was the most expensive. So the broadest network had something like 47,000 physicians in it. And as you pared down to the skinnier networks or the tiered networks, their cheapest network only had 1,700 physicians in it. So there were roughly 45,000 plus physicians who didn't have access to those patients. And those patients and those employers had to choose between, do I want more choice or do I want lower cost? Those are tiered networks. Exchange networks are the same thing, where they came in with the exchange products and said, look, for that product, if you want access to those people, you're going to have to accept less reimbursement. A lot of the payers really got behind the Medicare ACO model and decided that that was a wonderful way to contract, where they would contract with an ACO and hopefully eventually push risk off to the ACO. Remember the Enthoven budget-based capitation endgame. We've also seen an awful lot of discussion, but not a great deal of work around value-based contracting or value-based reimbursement, performance-based, whatever you want to call it. I think the payers are trying to move to this, but it's an extremely difficult process. So value-based contracting, for the most part right now, is a little bit like the unicorn syndrome. Everybody knows what a unicorn is, but nobody's ever actually seen one. And then there's an increase in capitation and risk transfer to providers to try to get the payers into a position that they want to be in. And in some states, all I'm seeing is simple fee schedule reductions. The payers are saying, look, I'm getting hurt by the exchange networks, or I don't like what happened, so here's your new fee schedule, and it's a 10% haircut. Take it or leave it. Next slide. So the question becomes, and I get this from a lot of physicians, well, why should I negotiate? And sometimes it's just out of pure throwing up their hands frustration, and sometimes it's a legitimate question. Is it really important? Should I really do anything about this? Well, I think it's incredibly important. I think it's important for the financial success of any healthcare provider. Healthcare reform means insurance companies are going to get more aggressive. Please understand that none of the insurance companies wanted healthcare reform to pass. They were hopeful after it passed that the Supreme Court would overrule it, and they didn't. This is not something they enjoy or like. And so when they get unhappy, they take it out on the downstream providers. Narrow networks are real. We're seeing them all over the country. Medicare is still going broke. Nobody's fixed that yet, so there's pressure on the federal government to fix this stuff. And managed care is largely targeting physician expenses because it's the easiest place to try to reduce cost. Hospitals have consolidated. They often have a market dominant position, but doctors largely remain unconsolidated and in competitive marketplaces. So from my perspective, in order to protect your future, you have to negotiate these contracts. As a friend of mine is fond of saying, remember, if you're not invited to dinner, it's probably because you are dinner. And I think in a large part of the country, physicians are deemed to be dinner right now. Next slide. So we're going to do a poll question just to get a sense from the audience where they stand on something.
Yes, folks. So let me launch this poll now. And as you can see, the question is, do you feel that payers have the upper hand during negotiations? So while we're waiting, you can answer yes, no, probably, and what can you do? So as we have people logging in, about half of you have voted now. We'll keep it open for about 20 more seconds. Just real easy. Just click on your answer. And so, wow, you guys are responding very quickly here. So we'll just give it a couple more seconds, and we will close the poll. And there we 88. Okay, now we've got just about all of y'all doing that. So we've cleared, we have closed it. Let me share the results. As you can see, the vast majority, 71%, have said yes, you do believe that the providers do have the upper hand in negotiation. So why don't you take us through the negotiation process?
So this is not at all surprising to me from the perspective of where the answers come out, but in some respects is a little bit surprising because I actually view it in a slightly different perspective, and that largely coming from my payer background side. And the reason why I view it in a slightly different perspective is you have to understand that the payers actually produce nothing. Okay, really what they do, they don't produce healthcare, they don't deliver healthcare. What they do is they take the product that you all produce, they put a package on it or wrapping on the present, if you will, and a bow on it, and they sell it. So when I was on the payer side, one of the things we understood was, gosh, if the providers really figure out that they've got an enormous amount of power, we're really in trouble. But almost every practice I talk to feels the same way. Either, yes, they've got an upper hand on me, or I really can't do anything. And that's one of the things that you've got to change before you go into the negotiation process. John F. Kennedy said one time, you know, never negotiate out of fear and never fear to negotiate. So you've got to change that mindset going into it. So now we're going to talk about the negotiation process. Negotiation is a process. It's not an event. If you ever walk into a negotiation not having done a fair amount of work ahead of time, walk out. Don't do it. I don't care whether you're buying a car, negotiating a hospital contract, negotiating with a payer, whatever. This process will help. Now the only, and I will admit this up front, the only place where this process has failed me and repeatedly failed me is when I negotiate with my 9-year-old daughter. She beats me every time and I can't figure out a way to win, so I've just given up on that one. So we're going to go through the negotiation process and how it works from the payer perspective. Next slide. Can we get the next slide?
Yes, it should be on there, the evaluate your position. Right?
Yeah, I'm not seeing it on my screen, Clint. I don't know if everybody else is.
It should be going on there. Hold on, please.
There we go. I've got it now.
Okay,
there we
go.
Thanks. So the very first thing in any process is evaluating your position. What do you bring to the table? What's your market position? Are you the dominant practice in that specialty, or are you a small practice? Who are your competitors? You need to know your payer mix, your payer fee schedules, and your value proposition. Now this is a critical piece. You need to know what all your payers look like on an apples-to-apples basis, how their fee schedules compare to each other on an apples-to-apples basis, what you bring to the table. And this is an area where the vast majority of the clients that I work with when I start working with them fail miserably. Now, one of the things to understand, this is information that the payers have about you and their competitors. So the payers all know what their competitors pay you because they capture competitive data through EOBs where they are secondary. So when I was on the payer side, it's incredible how many times I walked into a negotiation and I really knew more about a provider's fee schedules than they did. This puts any negotiator at an incredible disadvantage if you don't have this data. So I can't stress enough how important it is to understand your own position and your own data. Next slide.
Well, and as you were mentioning about that, Ron, that's one reason why we have Carl here, the Senior VP of Business Development for Medigain, about know your numbers. And before people come on board with Medigain, we do a practice analysis. So, Carl, you want to start talking about this?
Thank you, Clint. Well, as was brought out, knowing more about your practice, or at least as much about your practice as the insurance companies do, is a critically important piece of information in the negotiation. All of you have access to these numbers in your practice management software. Not necessarily easy to get out, but the information is there. One of the things that I like to do when I'm first looking at talking to a plan and first identifying which plans to negotiate with is take a look at their actual reimbursement by CPT code. And so in this particular slide, if we look down at the last line, my favorite code, 99214, and Ron may mention it, but you always want to negotiate on the codes you use the most to have the most financial impact. And by looking at this, we can see that Aetna is paying us $55 and Blue Cross, in this particular case, is paying $86 on the insurance side. Huge difference between those two. You might decide to go after Aetna rather than Blue Cross first. So having this information is available to you. I actually pull this off of live claims data, aggregate it, so we can look and see, what's going on. You have to pull out the effects of patient responsibility and deductibles and so forth, but really having a good understanding of what you're getting paid by CPT code is something that's critically important. But we can go a little deeper than that. Clint, to the next slide. So in this case, what I've done is by payer, I would look at charges, payments, and adjustments on what I call closed claims, or claims that are paid, mostly paid by the payer, by the patient. They're done, they're wrapped up in a nice box with a bow on top of it. This is a claim that went how it should have gone. So if we're looking at this by excluding things that just never get paid, if you're doing venipunctures or urine dips or pulse oximetry, and that's affecting your payment to charge ratio, if we can exclude that and say, what are they really paying us on the things they allow, this gives us a better feeling for the reimbursement percentage between the different payers. And so you could see in this example, pretty significant differences between, say, United Healthcare, who in this case is paying 69 cents on the dollar, and Blue Cross, who's paying 46 cents on the dollar. Again, points you in the direction of where to negotiate. Not that you shouldn't negotiate with everybody, because I think you should, but this is a good starting point. All right, next slide, please, Clint. And then we'll want to take a look at the payer mix. So looking at the volume by insurance company, but also in looking at the accounts receivable or the aging. Do you have a payer that is particularly slow to pay? So if you're looking at the size of a particular plan in your practice, the accounts receivable should be kind of commensurate with the volume of claims that you're submitting to them. So if you find you have somebody who's a slow payer, and in almost every marketplace we can find a number of plans that are slow payers, as you're negotiating, there's more to negotiating than just looking at the rates. So looking at payment patterns, delays, requests for medical records, other tactics that plans are using to slow down the payments, because it's not just how much you get paid, but how fast you get paid. That is a cash flow that fuels practice. Next slide, please, Clint. This is something that I also do. In fact, it's one of my favorite slides in our practice analysis. And what I'm looking for here is codes that were written off, where the charge equals a write-off or adjustment. Now that could happen for a number of reasons. It could be that you never got around to sending in the medical record, you run into timely filing issues, and the insurance company is just never going to pay the claim. But this will show you, and I've got it in two sections here, but I actually like to go in negotiations, a third step in this. I look at the plans and see how much is getting written off. So I can see that with Blue Cross in this example, that $192,000 over the course of a year was just written off. May be legitimate, may not be legitimate. It may be an issue with the billing and the follow-up on claims, but it may also be how you're coding. So really understanding what's not getting paid or what's getting written off is a very powerful tool. In the lower section of this chart, I have it broken out by CPT code. And to take this a step further is when you start looking at a plan and want to negotiate with somebody, especially say Blue Cross, is you want to have a good understanding of what things are not paying for. So I would look at claims that were written off by CPT code by insurance company So then you can talk to somebody and say, hey, you're not paying for a biopsy along with an office visit. I'm really doing this as a convenience to the patient. Is there something we can do about it? Now, as Ron will probably tell you, negotiating policies is probably even more difficult for insurance companies than negotiating rates, but it is something that's well worth talking about. Thank you, Quint.
All right, folks, we have a second poll question here for you. So the question is, do you feel that you have all the data that you need to better negotiate with the payers? Yes, no, make your choice there. How do I find this data? We're getting close to about half of you voting. Just real quickly, go up there, click your choice. We'll keep it open. About 80% of you all have voted so far, so just the rest of you go up there, make your choice. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds here to give you a chance to make your vote. So 5, 4, 3, 2, here we go. So we'll share the results with you there. So as you can see, about 43% of you say yes you do, then a third no, and another third how can you find this data, and we'll be giving you that here within the next portion of the webinar. So
I would jump in. This is Carl again.
Carl.
Before Ron takes back over, just jump in and say, if any of you out there are looking for help in getting this data, you know, Medigain would be happy to assist you in pointing you the right direction. And in fact, if you'd like to go through one of these practice analyses, we're happy to do that. That's a way we get to meet new physicians, and it's a way to learn a lot about your practice, the revenue cycle, as well as good data to use in managed care negotiations. Thank you. Back to you, Ron.
You bet. And we'll give you all that contact information here toward the end. So, Ron, here we go, part 2.
Great. So before I get into the evaluate your opposition, I just want to tell you, and this is a real story that will, I think, you know, support what Carl had said about how using this data, especially at an incredible level of detail, can really help. I was negotiating for a neurology client, and we were trying to get an increase in their fee schedule, and the payer sent us a proposal that had, you know, various rates by CPT code. And some of the CPT codes went up fairly significantly, some went down a little bit, and then in the bottom right-hand corner they had calculated a nice little average for us and said, see, this is a 7% increase in revenue. You know, look at what a wonderful thing we've done. Luckily, we were able to dive deep enough in the data that the CPT code that they increased the most was for Botox injections for migraines, and they increased it significantly. Well, the problem was they didn't cover Botox injections for migraine, so they don't pay for it. So this gets back to Carl's point about if they're going to write something off or it's a policy that they don't cover, it really doesn't matter what their fee for it is. You're not going to get paid for it. Now, that wasn't an accident by the payer. They showed that increase on a code they weren't going to cover because it made the average look good. Insurance companies are built on actuaries. They don't make math mistakes, okay? Once we removed that code, knowing we would never get paid for it because it wasn't a covered benefit, that 7% increase went down to a 0.5% increase. So it's just another example to show why having access to that kind of data, that kind of detail, can change your whole world from a negotiation perspective. So moving on, once you've evaluated your position, then it's time to evaluate the opposition, who you're negotiating against. What's their market share? Who's their competition? Are they currently profitable or unprofitable? Are they growing or shrinking? Have they just signed a major employer in the area that they want to make happy? What kind of leverage might you have against them? For example, if it's a carrier who has just recently been fined by the Department of Insurance for doing something bad, the last thing they need is more complaints to the Department of Insurance. So that might be a leverage point. Do they have any weaknesses, or are there any intangibles going on? You want to get a good picture of who it is you're negotiating against so you can understand what their pressure points are. Next slide. So you've evaluated your position, you've evaluated the opposition. Now it's time to set goals. What do you want out of this? And not just, I want more money, but what kind of reimbursement level? what kind of reimbursement system or type. What kind of contract term and termination? Do you want a 10-year deal? Do you want a 1-year deal? How do you want to be able to get out of it for either side, or don't you want to? Are there language issues that you need to have or need to keep out of there? You also, at this point, should calculate your walkaway point. Now, every contract has a walkaway point. And whenever I say that, inevitably, somebody will think, well, I couldn't possibly walk away from my largest payer. I couldn't walk away from Blue Cross. Well, what if they told you that their reimbursement now is going to be 10% of Medicare? Well, obviously that's below your cost. You'd have to walk away. You can't do it for that. So the point is, calculate where that point is and know it ahead of time. This is when you develop your opening position and your negotiating points. You will not get your opening position, so make sure you build in negotiating points, things that you can negotiate away. Either it's rates or language issues or policy issues, etc. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about some of the managed care strategies, and I'll go through some of these. These are things that they'll use as strategies to set you off your guard or to win the negotiations. The first one, and probably page 1 of any managed care company, is delay. Understand that you're asking for a raise, which means any time that they finish this deal, their costs are going up. So the longer they can delay getting it done, the better for them. I was at one of my former employees, we used to call this Our Lady of Perpetual Negotiations, and we would delay like crazy. You've got to keep trying to set deadlines, keep asking for response time frames, etc., to keep them from doing this. Limit of authority is another excellent negotiating tactic that they use. It's the same thing that car salesmen use. It's why when you're talking to the car salesman, he has to go talk to his sales manager. He can't agree to anything on his own. He's got to go to somebody else. That's called limit of authority. On the payer side, they'll talk about going to get corporate approval or legal approval or budgetary approval, etc. They've got a ton of it. You can do the same thing to them. If they're trying to force you into, pressure you into making a yes or no statement, you can say, I've got to talk to my partners. I have to talk to my accountant, my lawyer, whatever. 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, or a tactic that's called negotiating on a treadmill, is another delaying tactic. As you get things finalized, you get the rates finalized, now you're working on language, suddenly they'll add a new item to the list. And they keep adding items to, again, delay. Funny math. Funny math is this. Again, as I said before, carriers are built on actuaries. For those of you that haven't had the pleasure of working in a company in actuaries, actuaries are like accountants with less personality. Okay? They don't make math mistakes, but they understand how math works. Here's an example of funny math. Let's say you're being paid 150% of Medicare, and they offer you a 10% increase, and you get the contract and it says 160% of Medicare. That's not a 10% increase. 150 times 1.1 is not 160, it's 165. That's funny math. The issue that I talked about with the neurology group, with the 1 CPT code for Botox injection, that's funny math. So watch their math. Be very careful about it. The runaround is just what it sounds like. They keep sending you from person to person. Oh, I don't handle that. You need to talk to that person. I've been reassigned. This is your new negotiator, etc. Package pricing is a new thing that's in vogue with the carriers, where they're trying to bundle things together. Trust me, if they're putting pieces together to a package price, the total for that package price is less than what they used to pay for the pieces. So what you need to think about is, am I the one who's getting a cut, or is somebody else? Next slide. Divide and conquer. This is oftentimes where they'll pit hospitals against physicians. When I was on the payer side, I used to do this all the time. Physicians would ask me for an increase, and I'd blame it on the hospital. I don't have any more money. Your hospital asked for a huge increase, and vice versa. We've already talked about the ACO strategy, where they're trying to contract through ACOs using capitation. One of the favorite strategies of carriers is to keep talking about their corporate budget. This one, having been inside the belly of the beast, so to speak, I find almost hilarious. You'll be a small practice in Atlanta, Georgia, and you're trying to negotiate a little increase, and they say, oh, we really didn't budget for an increase for you. Now think about this for a minute. That would assume that they budgeted increases for every physician practice within their state and rolled it up into a big budget. When I managed, say, Cigna of North Carolina, I managed 15,000 physicians in 100 hospitals. There's no way that the budget is down to an individual physician practice. So that whole thing is just a way to get you to go away. We've talked about narrow networks. Some of their strategies will involve giving you increases, but not on all their products, only on some of their products. And oftentimes, it's only the products they really don't have much business on. Indifference is often a common strategy for managed care companies. Let me tell you how it works. So when I was on the payer side, you send me a letter saying it's been 5 years, I haven't had a raise, I need more money. What you get back is what looks like an obvious form letter. Dear, I fill in the blank. Received your correspondence on November 18th, requesting a change to your contract. Unfortunately, at this time, our budgetary restraints do not allow us to increase our medical expense. Thank you so much for providing care for my members. Sincerely, and I have my secretary sign my name and initial next to it. What I'm doing is sending a signal that you're so insignificant to me that I didn't even take the time to draft a letter or even sign it. And the point is, and you'd be surprised how many times that response letter gets the provider to just go away. They believe it, rather than understanding that they do have some power and some value. So if you get one of those, just push past it. Employer communications are oftentimes blaming providers for cost increases or exaggerating what would happen to the employers if they gave you a raise. Termination language and dates are something to be very careful about in watching your contract. Some of the carriers, United Healthcare specifically, have 1 day a year that you can terminate that contract. And if you don't give them enough notice before that day, your anniversary date, you're stuck for a whole nother year. So if your anniversary date is January 1st and you have to give at least 90 days notice, you have to send them a termination letter by October 1st. If you send them a letter on October 3rd, they will stop talking to you because you have to be in for a whole nother year before you can even get out. And so you've got to watch those as you're getting ready to negotiate. Next slide. Remember, negotiation is all about leverage. Create leverage, try to reduce theirs. And as I said before, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. You've got to negotiate these things, otherwise you're not going to get an increase. Provider strategies, the value play. What do you bring to the table? How do you save them money? Sometimes it's okay to do the non-par bluff, so to speak. Threatening to terminate or leave the network. If you have a powerful position, if you're the only neurology group in the area, or you do a certain service that other people don't, that can be a wonderful option. The court of public opinion. Threatening to take your message to the public. Tell the employer groups that you haven't had a raise in 8 years. Tell the community that this payer is paying you below Medicare, that you're not going to be able to spend as much time with each patient because they won't even give you a raise, that kind of stuff. The musical chairs strategy is when you negotiate all of your carriers at once, and it's like the musical chairs game. So you're negotiating 5 carriers. You tell each of the 5 carriers that, hey, I'm trying to negotiate everybody's contract. The first 4 plans that come in with a viable contract are going to have me. The 5th one, probably not. In other words, if you're left standing when the music stops, you stay standing. This will oftentimes get the carriers to speed up their negotiations to try to get one of those chairs. One of the things that's working right now fairly well is telling the carrier if you can't get enough money from them, you're going to sell to a hospital. Carriers hate it when physicians sell to hospitals because it increases their cost. And it's happening so much that that's one of the things that really scares the carrier. So you can say, geez, I want to stay independent, but if I can, I guess I can sell to the local hospital, and that will really increase your cost. The main thing you need to do is make the pain of the change less than the pain of the status quo. And what I mean by that is the carriers really like where you are today. They've got you on a fee schedule. They've got you on a contract. They probably had you there for years. You're asking for change, which is painful for them financially. But you've got to figure out a way to explain to them why it's less painful than if they do nothing. A perfect example, let's say you're a rheumatology group and you're currently doing infusions in your office, which save a bunch of money compared to the hospital. One thing you could say is, look, if we don't get enough of an increase, I may have to start doing these patients at the hospital. That will really increase your cost. Now you've made the pain of the change less than the pain of the status quo. Next slide. So how do you navigate all of this? What's the roadmap to the maze? Well, first of all, be proactive. Putting your head in the sand doesn't help. Hope is not a strategy. Be proactive. Map out your relationships. If you're a specialty group, understand where your primary care referrals come from, your relationships with hospitals, etc. This is getting more and more complicated with these narrow networks, so figure out how that goes. Stay involved with all local physicians organizations. Do not become the scapegoat. If there's an ACO formed in your community, try to get one of your doctors on the board or in a committee. I know that they hate committee meetings, and I get it, but you need to understand what's happening in there, and you need to get that internal intelligence, so to speak. You've got to develop the analytic and alternative payment capabilities. The data stuff that we saw before, it's critical now, and it's only going to get more and more critical. If you don't have the tools to do this, if you don't have the analytics, you're not going to win. Know your leverage points, what you bring to the table, what they're afraid of. Don't fall for the payer spin, the indifference, the complaining to the employers, that kind of stuff. And then once you've got all that figured out, once you've secured your flank, so to speak, and have all this laid out, then you start the negotiating. Next slide. So negotiation points to remember, and then we'll talk about sort of what happens now given the election. The Marines are fond of saying the best battle plan rarely survives first contact with the enemy. What I mean by that is, I don't know how many thousands of negotiations I've done over my career. I know how many I've done that went exactly the way I thought they would from start to finish. None. That's okay. Once you realize that things have changed or the payer's done something you didn't expect, then go down to number 2, which is adapt, adjust, and overcome. Everything is negotiable. Now, not everything is winnable, but everything is negotiable. Sometimes it's important to negotiate something you're not going to win. Carl talked about a coverage policy. Those are very difficult to negotiate because they're baked into an agreement with an employer. Now, doesn't mean you just give up. You may want to negotiate that knowing you're going to lose and use that to win a point somewhere else. I live in Raleigh, North Carolina. ACC basketball is huge here. Duke is always very good. Coach K argues calls with incredible vehement. Now, he knows he's not going to get that call reversed, and he's even said, I'm not arguing that call. I'm arguing for the next call, because he knows if he makes a big point out of it with the ref, maybe he gets the next call. That's what's important. I can't versus I won't. And this is important in negotiating language. Never, ever, 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 ever let somebody say, I can't. If you're asking for an increase in your reimbursement and the payer says, I can't do that, stop right there and say, what do you mean your computer system literally can't put a different number in there? And then when they say, no, it can, okay, well then you won't do it. What you're telling me is you're choosing not to, not that it's impossible. The reason for that in negotiations, why it's so important, is once you get them onto I won't, then you can start negotiating. Well, if you won't do that, what will you do? If you leave it at I can't, there's no negotiating and I can't. Next slide.
All right, we're going to take one last poll here, folks, to see after all this, are you ready for your next round of negotiations? So we've given you a sliding scale from 1 to 5. You're not ready at all. So you need to get ready. You're hopeful, maybe better. Go ahead and choose one of those. And then we have just a few more slides, and then we'll start the question and answer period. So about 60% of you have voted. Just go up there and click. We'll leave it open for about 10 more seconds. There we go. 75% have voted. Let's get a few more up there. Just take a click. And we'll close it here in just a few seconds. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now let's share the results. As you can see, yeah, half of you say you need to get a little more ready. 12% of y'all say bring it on. Y'all are very brave. So those are the results. Let's go ahead and continue on with the presentation. Okay, Rob?
Okay. Sure, absolutely. So I'm getting a lot of questions about, okay, well now we've had an election, what happens? So here's sort of what we know at this stage. First and foremost, Obamacare will not be repealed. Period, end of story, for 2 reasons. One, and the new, President-elect Trump has already said there are parts of it he likes, like no pre-existing condition exclusions, etc. The second is there's not a supermajority in the Senate, and there's no way the Democrats would not filibuster that, so it won't be repealed. It will be changed. We don't know exactly how yet, but it's definitely going to be changed. Most people believe that Medicaid expansion will not be rolled back, at least not in the next year or so. The problem is rolling back Medicaid expansion takes somewhere between 10 and 15 million people, and it removes their insurance. You take somebody's insurance away, it's a great way to become the ex-senator of whatever state you're from. So that's not unlikely to happen. The Republicans right now are scrambling for a plan. they were surprised by the election results as almost everybody else in the country. So right now they're working hard on what their fixed plan is going to be. If the exchanges are not fixed or something dramatic isn't done to them, you're going to see the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans start to leave en masse in 2018. The rest of the national payers, Aetna, Cigna, United, Humana, have for the most part abandoned the exchanges because they lost too much money. All the Blue Cross plans are losing tons of money. They're not going to continue to hemorrhage on that bad business, so to speak, unless something's done. So if something doesn't happen in 2017, you're going to see the exchanges start to collapse in 2018. Other than that, no one really knows what the administration is going to do, including the new administration. Now, I do think, given the announcements yesterday, we can get some clues to that. Tom Price, an orthopedic surgeon who's an admitted policy wonk and been a vocal opponent of Obamacare, is the new Secretary of Health and Human Services. That doesn't bode well for large sections of the Affordable Care Act being kept. And then the new head of CMS, SEMA, is a policy person who has helped a lot of states do Medicaid, managed Medicaid, which tends to suggest that anything that happens will be trying to take some of this publicly funded stuff and transferring it over to the insurance industry. Short of that right now, nobody really knows what they're going to do, including them. Next slide. So key points, and then we'll have about 10 minutes or so for questions. Remember, negotiation's not a process. It's a process, not an event. Prepare for it, get ready for it. Don't just walk in cold. You're not going to win many of those. You've got to effectively negotiate these contracts in order to succeed. It's the only area where you're going to get revenue increases without either increasing the number of your hours your doctors work or increasing the number of services you provide. Knowledge, analysis, data, planning, these are all things that are essential for a successful negotiation. I can guarantee you when I was on the payer side, I never walked into a negotiation without doing all of that stuff up front. Watch your contract language. Sometimes contract language can be as critical as rate negotiations. The example I gave of the 1 day a year that you can actually touch a United contract, know what those things are. And finally, be prepared. Don't go into a gunfight armed with a knife. You really don't win many of those. Next slide.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron. Okay, folks, on the right side of your screen there, you have a place where you can plug in questions. So we have a few, but I'll let y'all go ahead and put in some questions. Be expecting an email from me later on this afternoon where I will give you access to a copy of the slides, a recording of the webinar, and you'll also be able to get your copy of the ebook, Macro, the 7 Things You Need to Do Now. In the chat box, I did leave a link, metagain.com, choose day and time, because we're going to be doing this the next 2 Wednesdays as well. So tell your peers, the people that you're meeting at the Christmas parties, that it was a great webinar to go on. Email me if you need at marketing@metagain.com, or just reply to that email that I send you later on this afternoon. And like I said, contact the A-team. I will leave this up so you can get this contact information to get the kind of data and analysis. There's Carl's contact information, and below that you will see Ron's. So like I said, over 1,500 practices all around the country. And that was one of the questions, Ron, was do you find it harder to negotiate based on specialties or procedures or region? You've done it all across the country, so what is the hardest to negotiate?
The easiest answer is all the above. And your ability to negotiate or your leverage really is factored by a number of things. Some specialties carry with them more leverage than others. For example, pediatrics and obstetrics. You know, the payers know that you don't mess with moms and babies, but that's a great way to get people angry. Other specialties tend to have less negotiating authority or less negotiating leverage. Dermatology, ophthalmology oftentimes has hard leverage. That being said, if you are the dominant practice in that specialty in an area, you control market share, that can improve your leverage. Region is also another factor that goes into it. There are states that we work in that are extremely difficult where physician reimbursement on average is much lower than other states. I don't know how it developed that way. It's sort of a cultural thing. You know, the top 5 of difficult states to work in general are New York, New Jersey, Florida, Texas, and California. Other states, certain regions can be more problematic than others. So it's a combination of your specialty, how much market penetration or clout you have, do you have services that nobody else offers, and the region that you're in. All those factor into whether or not it's going to be a successful negotiation or not.
Great. One of the questions we had, Carl, was about the data on those slides that you saw. Now, our clients do have access to our reporting portal, Metagain Insights. But if they aren't a Metagain client yet, how do they do that practice analysis? What is the procedure for that?
The procedure for that is you could just shoot us an email at marketing@metagain.com, and we're happy to work with you on conducting analysis for your practice, and as a result of that, you will get much of the data that you'll need to do the negotiations. Aside from that, practice management systems have this data in them. It's not always easy to extract. How we do it is we basically suck a year's worth of live claims data out of the system, massage it in Excel in order to get real live information. You want to be careful not to fall into the trap of just running a report of charges and payments by insurance company and thinking that's all you need to know. There really is a lot more information out there. So definitely, you know, drop us a note, and we're happy to give you a hand with that. Thank you, Clint.
The deal is we have a team of analysts that go through and pull that information together to kind of show the charts that you were showing during the webinar, correct?
That's correct. And we do this regularly for our current clients through Metagain Insights. It's a data analytics portal that we have.
Okay, great. So, Ron, one of the questions is how far in advance should they contact you to get ready? I mean, you don't want them calling you on Tuesday saying, okay, I've got to negotiate with my payer on Wednesday. So what kind of headroom, what leeway do they need before they contact you?
Yeah, there's really two factors to that. One is that how long are you locked into a current contract, the contract you want to negotiate, and when can you touch it or get out of it, that magic termination date, or can it happen at any point after a certain date? So you want to look at the contract and find out when the availability is, back up by at least the amount of notice you have to give for termination if it's one of those contracts that will auto-renew if you don't terminate. The other factor that you think about is the quickest that any negotiation really gets done from start to finish is about 90 days. So you're going to have about 3 months of, if everything lines up and the stars and the moon all align, that's about the quickest. Most negotiations take between 4 and 6 months. So if you've got a January 1 renewal date that you want to touch, you're going to want to get started on that before October 1st. So it means you're going to want to start pulling the data and developing strategies probably in the July-August timeframe and get started in September. So roughly 6 months before the date that you really want to have it be effective, you should get started.
Well, what about the people like that do have a January or February? Is it too late now to call in the cavalry?
It's not too late now. You just need to understand that you're not going to have it ready by January. I mean, we get called on a lot of cases where somebody will say just that. Hey, it's the end of November. My contract renews on January. Can you get this done in the next 30 days? And the answer is no. It takes the payers, most payers, at least 45 days to actually load the new rates into their system. So that's part of that 90 to 120, 180 day time frame. So you get started sooner. Delaying anymore is bad, but you just have to understand that your actual effective date of the new rates isn't going to be January. It's probably going to be somewhere in the March, April, May time frame.
Right, but that doesn't mean, Ron, that you should. Doesn't mean you should hold off on starting those negotiations.
No.
I think that has to be an ongoing process with the practice. So you should be looking at those rates, looking at those contracts, knowing when they come due. But if you haven't negotiated rates, and I would say probably 9 out of 10 practices I work with have never touched the rates, now's the time to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And the really good practices, the ones who are on top of this, are almost in continuous negotiation with somebody, because by the time you get this one done and that one done and the other one done, the first one you did comes due again. It's a little bit like, you know, I grew up in Michigan, and the Mackinac Bridge is painted every year. They start in the spring. It takes them all summer to get to the other end. Winter hits, destroys the paint, and they start in the spring again. So, you know, the good practices on top of it are almost in a continuous process of doing this.
So, and their renewal dates are spread out throughout the year. It's not like everybody is going to say done on January 1.
Right.
Okay. So, folks, that's just about all the time that we have for today. We have the information up there. The data with Carl and the knight in shining armor is Ron. So be looking for that email coming from me later on this afternoon, which gives you access to this recording, to the slides, and to that ebook. Remember, we have another webinar at 1 Central today, and then we're going to do the same webinar at 11 and 1 Central Time on the 7th and 11 and 1 Central Time on the 14th. So if you'd like to get somebody else from your office to come in and hear this, please invite them, any of your peers, anybody in the same building or hospital as you. Once again, I would like to thank Ron and Carl for sitting in today. Carl, any closing comments?
I would just you know, encourage everybody to really take a look at the numbers and the reimbursements, and you know, from there, you know, engage the insurance companies. I have seen large practices, small practices, all be able to find a way to negotiate rates, and it's largely about trying to find some sort of a win-win for the payers. They're not going to give you more money just for fun. They need to give you more money because they think you're not going to be in their plan and they need you, or that you can do something for them that reduces their expenses. Thanks, Clint.
Ron, any closing comments?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with Carl more, and appreciate everybody's time and attention today, and appreciate your opportunity to put this on.
Oh, no problem. All right, folks. Well, thank you very much for attending. Look forward to that email. And we'll have more webinars throughout the years, so be tuned in. Carl and Ron, I will see you all the next time around. Thank you, folks.